You may have heard the old joke about the married couple who went to see a marriage counsellor about a number of relationship issues. As they finished one session, the counsellor sidled up to the husband and suggested that for homework this week, he might do something special for his wife. So he decided that he would. He bought a huge bunch of red roses and arrived home and thought he would surprise his wife. So he decided to knock on the front door and present the flowers to his wife when she opened the door. So he knocked on the front door and his wife opened the door, but before he could give her the flowers, she burst into tears and said, "Look, I've had a bad day. The washing machine broke down, the kids overflowed the bath, and I had to take the dog to the vet. And now you've come home drunk." Change can be very, very difficult for us all to get our heads around. And indeed, this congregation has had a number of changes over the last 18 months to 2 years. Some people, of course, sometimes act beyond our habitual impression of them, or we can misjudge their intentions. And concerning any new thing, we should never consult the person whose life it is about to change. In this passage from the book of Acts, we have an example of continuity and innovation in the life of the early Jesus movement. The new community of followers of Jesus numbered about 120, about the number of what we have sometimes here on a Sunday morning. And they had an issue that they had to resolve in some way. The suicide of Judas had created a vacancy in the ministry of the disciples, and for a number of reasons, the disciples felt that the vacancy needed to be filled. The first act of this new community then was to appoint one of their number to take the place of Judas. This filling of the number to 12 again was considered of great importance for the disciples. Perhaps they thought that in the old religion which they still practiced, of the Jewish faith, there were 12 tribes of Israel. And perhaps that was the reason why they felt that the number needed to be made up to 12. It is remarkable that the 12 play a small part in the rest of the book of Acts. Only 3 of them are being mentioned again in the book: Peter, James, and John. And Matthias, after being appointed, never again. But the replacement had to meet certain criteria. It must be someone who, in the words of the author of this book, who was accomplished us during all the time that Jesus went in and out among us. He had to be a witness with us to the resurrection. So this text reminds us that leadership in the Christian community has as one of its responsibilities to ensure that there is continuity between the gospel tradition and the message that is expressed today. In appointing Matthias to the 12, continuity with origins is assured by such leadership. What we have in this story is the church's dire need for continuity, the link with tradition, the linkage to the past. It would be interesting for us here as a congregation of St. Michael's to ask and to tease out what you thought were important elements of the tradition of St. Michael's that needed continuity and needed to be affirmed and built upon. But this is also a story about the church's need for innovation. for modification and adaptation in order to meet the new challenges that they faced. In my experience of church life, which goes right back to 1970 when I graduated from theological college, and before that as a youth leader in a local congregation, church leadership is a constant struggle between continuity and innovation. It's a struggle. When I was minister to St Leonard's Parish in Brighton, the church council decided that we needed more modern seating in the front half of the church building. We had very heavy wooden mountain ash pews that took 6 AFL footballers to lift up. We asked the congregation for some input into this decision making. And I remember one lady getting up at a meeting opposed the change as she said that she'd sat in that church pew with her husband for years before he died, and she always sat in the same place every Sunday because she felt that her husband was with her. So after some negotiation, I sold her the church pew and we delivered it to her house. So she could sit on it all the time. Continuity and innovation. We cannot have one person saying to the rest of the congregation, just because they're against an idea, that that's what has to happen. We had to negotiate and try to come to a satisfactory conclusion. So while the constant tension is between honouring the tradition of the church is also called to courageously follow the leading of the divine Spirit into new areas of ministry and witness. In order to do that, we need transformative leaders who enable us to innovate. In our contemporary ecclesiastical structures, I wonder if we are more in danger of stifling the leading of the Spirit than we are in forgetting our past. An example is the first ministry of women in our country, which was first recognised in the last century, around about the 1930s, among the more Pentecostal and less institutional churches. There were those who in the more institutional churches who saw this move into women being ministers as a departure from the tradition of the church and therefore to be resisted at all costs. And those who saw this as an opportunity of equity and innovation. The battle, of course, still continues in parts of the Anglican Church, in the Ballarat and Sydney dioceses, and of course our Catholic friends who won't even enter into the discussion. The American Episcopal priest Lauren Mead, in his book 5 Challenges for the Once and Future Church, asks the question, do we who love our religious traditions and systems have the time to redesign, reinvent, or redevelop them for the next generation? Can we who have inherited such riches from earlier generations of faithful people pass on an even stronger heritage of faith to the next generation? The election of Matthias in Acts reminds us that the new fledgling Christian community was not bereft of leadership. A new apostle was chosen for a new age. And God's Spirit prods us forward, and sometimes a major way of prodding us is through leaders who keep beckoning on and us on to the future that awaits us. Thus, the story of Matthias is a story about God-given transformation. And it has always been thus in the life of the church. The church that first erupted from the womb of Judaism to become the increasingly doctrinal, precise religion of the Roman Empire when Constantine embraced Christianity was subsequently challenged and renewed by the desert fathers of Egypt, and then the birth of Western monasticism. And then in the 11th and 12th centuries, these developments were themselves transformed by the Cluniac reform of the monasteries, from which in turn arose the revival of Europe's Middle Ages under St. Dominic and St. Francis of Assisi. Further transformation, of course, occurred in the Reformation in the 16th century of Martin Luther, John Calvin and Zwingli and Martin Bucer and others. And this shift towards the individual and modernity was again renewed by Pietism and the great evangelical awakenings of Europe and America for the 17th to the 19th centuries. And people such as John Wesley and Jonathan Edwards, who started Yale University in the States, were involved in that transformation. So in this potted view of church history, I've tried to point out that when the church grinds down to maintaining the status quo, God raises up new movements or leadership that takes the church into uncharted waters. And maybe that is what has been happening when Dr. McNabb was here. And following on from that, as many of you in this congregation have been involved in the progressive Christian movement in Victoria, and St. Michael's has been a leader in this movement here in Melbourne and in Victoria. So as we survey the mainstream churches today, it would seem that the old paradigm no longer works, and a new paradigm needs to be born. Tony Robertson, in an article on church leadership, suggests that there are 4 elements to creating a new paradigm for the church. One is that ministry needs to give a greater role to the laity. And I've expressed this many times to you people, that you are ministers of this church, every single one of you. And you have a contribution to make to that ministry, which is unique to St. Michael's. When someone in the congregation says, "Oh, we ought to be doing this," Robertson says he learned as a minister to say, "That sounds just like the thing God may be calling you to do." A second element to this new paradigm is to expect trouble. Too many ministers see themselves as peacekeepers. Ministers like to be liked. And in congregations, the relinquishment of one belief or procedure and embracing another can produce conflict, as we all know. And change will often produce conflict. But we need to look at that and to grow through that conflict. And the third element is to value small steps. It is a virtue to have a long-range vision. Over the years, I have read dozens of vision statements, mainly in schools, of course, where I've been a chaplain. I've been part of strategic planning committees, spent hours discussing words, phrases, punctuation, vision, or mission statements. In my view, those statements have hardly made any impact on the behaviour of those institutions. There is something inherent within the nature of the gospel that values small things. Think about the widow's coin, the pearl of great price, the few seeds that fell on the good soil. Small things that the world regards as being insignificant. And remember that as you ring up that sick person that is a friend of yours in the congregation and you haven't seen for weeks. Or when you visit someone in hospital, or when you meet a friend from the congregation here or outside the congregation for a coffee and a chat. And the fourth element is don't overvalue consensus. Now, I might get into trouble about this in the Uniting Church, but my own view is that the problem with consensus is that often decisions that need to be made are immobilised through a whole period of time as we seek consensus. Now, I'm not advocating that we have the bishop's way of doing things where the bishop says this is how it's going to be, and you either my way or the highway. But early in my ministry in a parish in Brisbane, I thought I had to get everybody in the congregation on board before the congregation could do anything. So this might be controversial, but why does everyone in the congregation have to approve or to participate in every ministry of the church? No, we need to look at our gifts and to embrace those gifts and say, this is what I can do for the betterment and for the nurture and for the growth of this congregation. Not everything needs to be put to a vote. Matthias was elected as a church leader by casting lots. Just imagine that. If we wait until everyone is on board, we can sometimes disempower those in the church who are ready to take risks for the congregation. So from the earliest days of the Jesus movement, the church's common assumption has been that its central business is to go, to be sent to those people or places in need. And that consciousness of being sent has undergirded the church's sense of who and what it is. To be involved in the church's mission was to be sent. And that is why Matthias had to be chosen. Continuity and innovation. And in these days of challenge for St. Michael's, we need to believe that there will be leaders within this congregation who will rise up and that the ministry of this great church will be fulfilled. Amen. And our blessing. Lord of light, shine on us. Lord of peace, dwell in us. Lord of might, succour us. Lord of love, enfold us. Lord of wisdom, enlighten us. And then, Lord, let us go out as your witnesses in obedience to your command to share the good news and love for all. Amen.